So. All right. Hello. And good morning. I just came back from Ohio, where something, and America, where something quite extraordinary is taking place. Barack Obama is in the lead, and people I'm meeting now is saying that he's going to win with a shocking victory, a landslide, a remarkable victory, a substantial victory. It will be a victory for Barack Obama. That's what people say right now, and that is, of course, amazing in so many ways. One of the most interesting things about it is that it wouldn't have happened without new media and social media. He has been using new technology to mobilize voters, to fundraise, and to spread his message in a way that nobody else has been doing before, and he couldn't have won without it. Therefore, we have invited, and it's really a great pleasure, Peter Leyden, who is, I think, the best guy on this subject in the States, the leading expert in politics and new media. He was the director of the think tank New Politics Institute. He was previously managing editor at Wired, director of Global Business Network's pioneering think tank. He's also worked as a journalist, of course, a special correspondent for Newsweek in Asia, and he's been co-authoring 2 books, The Long Boom and What's Next. But right now, as I said, he is the leading expert of the most exciting political media phenomena in the world, how Barack Obama is changing politics these months. Welcome, Peter Leyden.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we have the slides here? Thanks. It's great to be in Europe. It's great talking about the election. It seems like there's obviously a huge buzz right now about what's going on in the States, what's going to happen to get beyond the Bush years. I know there's caused a lot of consternation here in Europe. There's been a lot of interest in Obama himself, like African-American, son of an immigrant, becoming president. But I'm going to really talk to you, what I call about the Obama moment is really, it's bigger than all that. We're really in an extraordinary moment in American history. And it is really more like on a handful of times in American history we've seen this kind of change in politics. And I'm going to make the case for you now. I'm also going to talk about how central technology and new media has been to this, but also is going to be into governing coming up here. And we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but I want to basically try to get across this full kind of complex argument here. Now, Barack himself has been constantly talking about America, this is our moment. It's an historic moment. It's different. It's big. It's not just another cycle. It's not even just getting past one administration of 8 years. There's something bigger going on. And in fact, he's absolutely right. He has his own way of describing this. But the way I would describe this is there has been literally a handful of times in American history where we watched an explosion of political and social innovation that takes about 10 to 20 years, that we completely reinvent essentially America at some level, at some fundamental level, to deal with very basic challenges and fundamental restructuring of our country. It happened in the early 19th century, right after the Revolutionary War kind of period. It happened with Thomas Jefferson, the founding of the Democratic Party. It happened around the Civil War with the founding, essentially, of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln. Again, a run of a couple decades there of incredible innovation. It happened at the beginning of the 20th century for about 20 years, what we call our progressive era, our classic progressive era. And it happened with the Great New Deal, the Great Depression, and the rise of Hitler in World War II. We're in that kind of moment now, I would argue here. Now, what happens in these moments, essentially, is 2 things. They either come from the response to deep structural change in the economy and society, or they actually come from unprecedented challenges that the country's never been able to face before. And the old politics is completely inadequate to deal with it, and so there has to be, at some level, some kind of response from politics. The thing that happens in terms of solving these things, in every one of these periods, 3 things has come together, which is in fact happening today. One, there's almost always a new technology and a new media transformation. A new tool that basically people can take and leverage to new ends that they couldn't do before. The second thing that happens is there's always some kind of massive population change that restructures the politics in a fundamental way. And the third thing is we basically have we have essentially a wave of new ideas about how to deal with that era's challenges. Now, this has happened. I'm going to go quickly here to give you a sense of how this happened. It happened when essentially the country went from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, or from rural living to urban living, and that happened in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And so what we had then was what we call our classic progressive era in the United States history books. It happened for about 20 years here. Now, what happened then, just again, this is kind of interesting new media thing. What happened then was that was the rise of the great new newspaper empires. Essentially, we were able to mass produce newspapers in a way that we couldn't do before. So this was the first real mass media. That was a big tool. It also brought women into, women hadn't voted up until that time. They got the vote in that period. Immigrants from Europe essentially drove the changes there. And ultimately, we had a wave of new ideas of how to actually democratize and humanize the economy. And again, if we had more time, we can go into more things here. But from an American history point of view, we broke up the great robber barons. We established a progressive income tax. Women got to vote. Unionized workers. Child labor ended. All these different things that at the time were seen as very big advances into the restructuring of American economy and society. The second time it happened in kind of this century was in the middle of the century, and that was in the rising into the great challenges of the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, communism. Again, things that the old politics, the old laissez-faire, conservative politics just didn't know how to deal with in the 20s there. And so, in fact, they had the same thing there. In this case, they had broadcast radio, the beginning of broadcast electronic media. They had essentially a new configuration of politics, which we could go into more detail another time, and ultimately had a bunch of new ideas of how to deal with this. And so what happened in that period is you watched in literally 15 years, you watched a new way to intervene government into the economy. You watched a new way to defend and contain kind of against nuclear war, even by the end of that. Along with Europeans, we built the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, completely new institutions to deal with the new global economy or the international economy at that time, and ultimately an explosion of innovation in 15 years. Again, we're in one of those moments now. This is really the kind of level I think we're watching a change in politics right now. And I think this is why Obama has been able to tap into that kind of energy in the country. What's happening now? Fundamental restructuring, as we all know, about computer and internet technologies. It is fundamentally changing the groundwork of how essentially our entire economy and society works. The biggest story, as we would know in this age here, is the restructuring of everything into this global frame, the globalization of everything. People in 50, 100, 500 years from now, they'll look back on the early 21st century and say, that's when the world went global. That's how fundamental the structuring is going on in the economy. And we're seeing a wave of new challenges in the 21st century that are completely unprecedented, not the least of which is global warming. But there are all kinds of them. I mentioned here, if you see on here, every one of these new challenges is a huge, complex problem that any era would have a really difficult time trying to figure out. We've got to do them all simultaneously in about the next 10, 20, or 50 years at the very least. What is happening on the solution side, though, is we're basically coming together these same three things. As I mentioned, the biggest media technology transformation the world has ever seen, bar none, in terms of its scope and its the speed of its happening. Of course, it's happening with the internet and computers. The second thing in America, which I'm going to go over here, which you might not be aware of, we are going through a fundamental restructuring of our population right now. Very fundamental change, as fundamental as it was in the early 20th century with the immigration from Europe. Very, very huge change going on there. And ultimately, there's a whole new wave of ideas of how to deal with sustainability, climate change, new energy that essentially is starting to go. Now, this is a media thing, so most people here know a lot about media, but I want you to just throw some statistics up about that, how big a deal it is, just from the American perspective. And I think I'll go very fast here, but I did want to just show the kind of couple of American numbers to compromise, or to kind of show you here how quickly it's changing in the United States. The peak of newspaper circulation was 1984, the arrival of the Macintosh, frankly. And what's happened is they have lost 45% of their circulation in the last, up until that time. Now, any business that loses that kind of business is going to be traumatized. And every single newspaper in the United States is fundamentally shaken right now. It's not at all clear where it's going to go. The same thing with broadcast and the same media that I mentioned happened in the middle of the century. Look at the numbers here for the fall of broadcast audience. Actually here. Broadcast audience from the mid-'80s has gone no place but down. Now, some of that was taken from cable audience to picking it up. But what is really happening here is this is the penetration of the digital video recorders, TiVos, or I don't know what you actually call them here, but essentially they're the ones that you can basically skip all commercials. And in fact, that's exactly what's happening. This was a Nielsen rating story that was considered positive, that was, hey, 40% of people with these are still watching commercials or advertisements, but of course 60% don't. We're watching a fun, and again, $60 billion goes every year into television ads in the United States, and pretty quickly that's going to have to find a place. Where is that going to go? Now, the new media stuff, again, I'm going to go fast here because I want to get to the politics of it. But again, just the numbers out of nowhere. Just remember, 4 years ago, YouTube did not exist. And here, within the first year, it was hitting 100 million video streams a day. It's rumored to be about 200 million video streams a day. They're not saying for sure, but it's basically different ways to kind of calculate that. Phones, we're now seeing basically 30% of all people with phones in the United States don't have landlines. They only have mobile phones. That's probably higher here in Europe. I don't even know how that works. But basically, it's starting to fundamentally shift now to mobile phones. Mobile in the United States is a gateway to minorities. If you look at these numbers here, and I'm going fast, but if you look at the numbers here, very high penetration, more high use actually with African Americans and Hispanics than the white population. So it's very much a way into media, into the minority groups. And ultimately, of course, we got the Facebook, MySpace numbers. And in fact, this was just from the summer. It's now, I think actually Facebook is now pumped up again. But again, huge numbers. You get that part. I just want to kind of just say the numbers for the states are really starting to bite as well. Now, American population, you might not know as much about this one, but the millennial generation is the young people in their 20s and teens. It is the biggest generation in American history, bar none, bigger than the baby boom. And if you look here at essentially an age pyramid, this is a classic way demographers talk about population. This is extended to 2015, which is essentially what the American population will be in 2015, with, again, old people at the top and young people there, and then men and women. This is the baby boom that everyone's worried about, and there's a baby boom in Europe that's doing the same thing, which is essentially not dying off fast enough, and so they're stressing all the social systems that we're all worried about. But what people are not seeing is in America, and I'm not sure exactly how that works in the here in Europe, but it's a bigger generation. It's their children, but it's also immigrants. There are two things combined there that are actually lifting the numbers up in the United States. Why is this important? Because this generation is essentially trending very progressive and very democratic. In 2000, with Kerry here, if it was just young people voting, it would have been a landslide for Kerry. This is essentially the numbers here for the 2006 congressional elections. They voted overwhelmingly for Democrats, and I'm going to show you in a minute what's happening today. And of course, they're using these new technologies. The one people here might not be as aware of, and I want to just say here, is Hispanics. And this is, again, because of new media, it's a very important way to think about this. One is, by 2050, almost 30%, 29% of all Americans will be Hispanic. This is a very huge shift, and it's very fundamental. It's causing a lot of kind of angst, essentially, in American population. Not as much as immigration here, but it's still very interesting. Because if you look here, the trend lines, this is essentially the minority population in the United States up until today. This is the white population as a percentage. This is today. But look at the projections very conservatively are by 2050, there will essentially be a majority of the country will be minority. Again, why is this important? This is essentially why a guy like Obama is not that bizarre in the United States. Because Americans are essentially living this kind of mixed race, kind of polyglot culture, and ahead of the game here, ahead of what Europe's actually seeing. Right now, essentially, too, this is a snapshot right now in the United States. All those border states, California and Texas, over a third of the populations are Hispanic. Again, something, and even into the heartland, you can see here from the map, it's starting to get very, very serious percentages of Hispanics. Why is that important? Well, the same thing's happening here. This is a shift in the Hispanic vote towards the Democrats from 2004, when Bush did pretty well, to essentially 2006, where it started to actually, this is the congressional race there. Now, I'm going to move here quickly to this paradigm shift, today's political paradigm shift, because this is the tech thing that I think I want to focus on. So the beginning piece of this shift is essentially the shift in technology of politics. That's catalyzing and pulling this whole thing together. Now, how did politics work before? It worked in the United States for 3 ways it worked. It basically works the same in Europe from the beginning of broadcast television. If you basically were able to amass a lot of money, you had to go to wealthy people or corporations, basically, or big unions to basically get enough money. That was how it would work. You had to, for organization, you had to have the party establishment under your belt. You had to have them there. And ultimately, for media, you had to master 30-second advertisements and TV. If you did this best, you always won. Always won. No way around it until now. And what's happened is a new model was cracked by Howard Dean in the last cycle, was the first one to use the internet in a new way. Wasn't mature enough to make it all the way to win, but he actually started to crack the model. And what's happened now is, in fact, that model is this. This is the model, by the way, that Obama takes. One is for fundraising. You don't have to go to the big fat CACs. You can actually tap into many, many, many middle-class people and aggregate much bigger sums. 2, you don't need the party. You can go outside the party. You can organize people, particularly with internet technologies. And 3, you have to play the game of TV, but you actually really get strategic advantage through the web. And all 3 of these is what Barack did. He took it to a much higher level than Dean ever did. And it is the only reason, basically Martin mentioned it, it is the only reason he was able to beat Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton had all the traditional advantages. She ran the best campaign on the old model that any Democrat has ever done, and she lost. And she lost because of this new model upset her, and it was Barack who was able to do that. Now, from a Republican point of view, I'm not being partisan here, but the Republicans are a whole cycle behind. John McCain is completely in the old model. They do not understand the new model. And in fact, if you watch close enough in the United States, the one person, the Howard Dean of the Republicans, was a guy named Ron Paul. And he wasn't able to win, but he basically used the new model very effectively. So it'll take another 4 years for them to come up. Now, how does this political paradigm shift work? How does it work? I'm going to show you some numbers here. The first one, again, is in fundraising. From a few wealthy people to the many, many, many people pitching in a little bit of money. Look at the numbers here. This is essentially the last campaign. If you can see the numbers here, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, the colors there. The first quarter of 2007, last year is when the campaign started, Hillary and Barack were about neck and neck. Same for the next quarter being three-month cycles here, right? So the first quarter, even, second quarter, even, third quarter, even, fourth quarter, roughly even. It's still pretty even. And then came the real first primaries. And then what happened in January? Boom. You see Barack taking off. Then you see the second month, February, boom, Barack taking off. And then you see even the third month right there. Those are months, not quarters. So if you combine those 3 months, the quarter would be through the roof right now. Now, the only way you could do that was with internet technologies to scale up. The only way. You could not have done it the old way. The other thing, just to show you how the old school, all the Republican money using the old kind of way methods essentially was beat by all, this is for every race up until through the primaries. The Democrats clearly were much ahead because they're much more ahead in these fundraising techniques, and so it's giving them big strategic advantage. Now, why is this important? Because technology can scale. So in the old days, if you could basically get about 100,000 rich people or corporations to throw in, you could make enough money to run for president. Then, essentially, Barack Obama, in the primaries, our kind of preseason, essentially, to get the nomination, he had 1.5 contributors who could just throw in a little bit, and that's even more money. He raised more money. But the thing is, for the general election here, it's very conceivable he might get as high as, it's not clear yet exactly, but you could have many, many more contributors, and so you can really blow away the numbers here. And ultimately, you can start to see, once you scale this, who knows what the sky's the limit? Who knows how many people in the United States will basically get in future kind of cycles here where it starts to really get serious. Organizing. I'm going to do this quickly here too. Just give you the facts so you can see that this is not just me talking about this. Democratic turnout. Now, yeah, it's been an exciting race and stuff, but I'm telling you, 2004 was an exciting race too. People really were frustrated on the Democratic side with Bush. But look at the turnout numbers here, basically. The Democrats from 2004 to 2008 had more than doubled the number of people came out. And in fact, they almost more than doubled the Republican turnout. Now, why is that? Yeah, excitement, various things. The tools. The tools were allowing us to get out a vote in a much, much more a different way. One of the good insights into this, why is it tool-oriented? Look at young people. Young people who do use these tools more than anybody, they almost tripled their turnout in some of these states. These are all state by state, just showing you, again, the light blue from 2004, the dark blue for this cycle, basically. This is the share of the vote. This might be getting too deep in there because we don't have enough time. But essentially, this is a percentage of all voters. The young people essentially took a larger share of all voters in every one of these states. Again, these are the kids that are essentially tapping into these new tools. And they're basically able to take a larger share from old people, a larger share from more of the traditional constituencies. Again, almost a half again increase in their share. And this is essentially Hispanic turnout. Record turnout. This is, again, these things they actually go much higher here for California and Texas. But again, over the 2004, huge increases. Again, overwhelmingly to Democrats, if you look at these compared to the Republicans. Tools. It's new tools. That's really, I would say, now, it's other things too, so I don't want to say it's only that. But what's about the tools is politics is always about social networking. It's always been about getting friends and families to the polls. Now you just do it with essentially the new technologies, essentially supercharges it. MyBarackObama.com, which if we have time, we might chat a little bit about that. It's incredible what they're being able to do there, how average citizens can kind of tap into this and actually move into the politics. So what's happening in the United States in the space of literally just about a cycle or so is we've gone from a very small centralized paid staff to essentially a situation where you are going to have essentially by the election date this fall, basically, you're going to basically have, probably, 2 million people who will be waking up every day for the next month here and actually thinking they're working for the campaign, even though they are not paid a dime. But they're able to do this because they can tap in through these technologies. Now, the third thing is in media, and it's actually playing out in politics. And again, we could talk a lot about this, but here's just an example of how in the first quarter, actually this is this is for the first quarter of the primary of this year. Look at the difference between Barack Obama's YouTube views and Hillary, and for that matter, John McCain's, who's barely even in the game here. Very, very significant. Now, these have just continued to go up all summer here, too, so I could update this. The point is, this started to give strategic advantage because they still were all playing TV. They have to play that game. But this was actually able to, pop it higher. And again, look at the average length, the average number of views for just Obama's top 10. Average length, 13 minutes. 13 minutes, not 30 seconds, 13 minutes. Huge difference of what's going on. You're able to really, really stay with people in this space. Now, people say, well, eyeball gap. Well, yeah, but TV still reaches more people. True, but look at what's happening here. Everybody looking at that video actively wants to be doing it as opposed to not giving a rip in television. You can go as long as you want beyond 30 seconds. 30 seconds, what can you learn in 30 seconds? You can barely learn anything. You can barely get moved. If you spend 13 minutes, you're going to get connected to somebody, which is what's happening. You're immediately linked to fundraising. If you watch a television commercial and you want to give money, you don't even know how to do it. Do I phone someone? Do I look on the web? I don't know where to go. With this stuff, you just push the button next to it, put your credit card in, boom, you raise money. That's what's happening. Anyhow, very easy to get involved, goes through your personal networks, all the viral things we know about it. And so what's happened is, and this is everything, what everybody knows, without question, the most remarkable advertisements of this cycle in America have been essentially free, made by supporters. You can see some of these. The Will I Am, Yes We Can thing, for those that know it. The Hillary 1984 ad. All these are the great ads, essentially, that was happening. And ultimately, the great thing about it is you didn't have to buy it. You didn't have to place it. You didn't have to pay for anything to get them seen, not just locally, nationally, but globally, because a lot of you people were able to watch it too. This is a paradigm shift. When you get a paradigm shift, that's when it really upsets everything. So what I'm saying, to sum up, we're shifting in front of our eyes here, this cycle, from a paradigm where you really essentially are shifting from control of a wealthy kind of fundraising to actually tapping into many. We're actually seeing the shift from having to control the party to essentially being able to go outside the party and ultimately just having to do TV to now doing the web. Now, where I'm going to shift here, because we're going to cover the final little thing here is the bigger move is top-down, bottom-up. And right now, I think this is where we're at. I think with Obama here, we're starting to see how bottom-up is actually starting to beat top-down. The old way of politics was very, very top-down, very controlled. This new thing is out of control, but it's winning. Now, what do we do now? This is where I'm just going to shift to what's going to happen, I would say, post-election. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. You can never be too sure in politics. But I would say, as Martin mentioned, it's starting to break very clearly here, and I've been saying for a long time, it's going to be very hard to stop this new politics with the old traditional politics, which is what McCain is trying to do right now. And so I think it's going to be a substantial win. We'll see. Hard to predict. Crazy stuff happens. But anyhow, if it does happen like this, what are we going to do? What, not just America, but what is the world going to do about global warming? The most complicated problem humans have ever faced is changing the climate. We've changed the climate. Now we've got to stop changing it. Terrorism. Haven't figured it out yet. We've spent a lot of money, a lot of time in kind of crazy ways all over the world trying to figure this out. Hasn't figured it out yet. We got to find a more secure way to live in the 21st century. And the globalization of this economy is tearing the fabric of a lot of societies up, including in Europe. These are fundamental system change things that our politics in the West, our politics globally, but also in politics in the United States has to address. How did they do it before? It's a good instruction just to think back. At the time that Roosevelt came into power in 1932 in a landslide victory off a conservative that seemed to be failing, like Hoover, very similar, I would say, to what's seeming to happen with Bush and the kind of craziness going on with the kind of the financial markets even. It's almost like taking a script right out of the book here. What did they do? Roosevelt had no idea what to do, basically. The New Deal that we look back on as the Great New Deal was a slogan. It had been basically cribbed, just taken from a journalist, frankly, in the campaign. They had no idea. The day he was inaugurated, he shut down the banking system for 10 days as a holiday and said, get everybody who knows anything about banking in a room and come out the other end with an idea. And that's what they did. But what they had was an entrepreneurial attitude, innovative attitude, and they trial and error. And what they basically did what they could do with the tools of their time. And essentially, in this space, their technologies was take a bunch of white guys, it wasn't even women, and put them in with chalk in a room, which is the chalk in here. This is kind of like the way you can solve problems. Now, I say this because we have a lot different deal. Now, in 15 years, they went from that crazy time, less than 15 years, to essentially the system that to this day we are living in. IMF, World Bank, all the stuff we know, Bretton Woods Accord, all that stuff, it's essentially the same system we're building on. Not just Americans, but obviously with a lot of European help too. It wasn't just the FDR and American thing, but it was a huge thing. Now, why is that important? Because we have incredible resources. With the computer power and the internet power, it is just an insane, essentially, tools, essentially compared to what those folks had back there to deal with, granted, very complex deals. And so I want to just say, watch for the paradigm shift after the election in terms of policy making and governing, because I think we're going to see a very similar thing happening to what we saw in politics, electoral politics. One is if you take the old model of how things work in Washington, or I would imagine in Brussels or however else you think about the policy-making apparatus here in Europe or your own countries. Essentially, the old model has several very similar kind of factors, essentially. Oops, how are we doing here? One is essentially it's all funded by wealthy special interests. Corporations run, basically put the money behind, the energy policy is all funded by ExxonMobil and folks like that. So you're not going to get the greatest, or crazy rich people. Those are the two things. Two, it's all done by insiders who go in and out of government and into these policy think tanks. And ultimately, it's not using new media at all anyway. It's basically just doing the old model. So what could we start to do here? We could start to, one, get different kinds of funding, but also what we could start to do is through technologies tap into a much larger network of people who understand these problems and start to leverage these new media and these new technologies. And just to kind of remind you, the beauty of technology is its ability to scale. Right now, you can only get maybe 100 in Washington terms fellows in an institute to kind of figure out how to do climate change. We need to basically get 10,000 people figuring this out. Luckily, through technology, you can do that. The second thing about technology, as we know, is parallel processing. You take, like a server farm, you take a big problem, you break it into small problems, figure it out, and aggregate it up. Well, that's what we have to basically do with essentially all these problems, essentially I mentioned to you. We already went over them. Well, every one of those has to have a solution. We've basically got to take every one of those issues, and even within every one of those issues, we have to take just clean energy, for example. Getting our electricity grids to 100% renewable is going to take incredible work in policy and true innovation in the economy in all these different areas. How do you store it? How do you use solar? How much wind? All this stuff. You're doing a lot with wind here, which is fantastic. But we got to do a lot more. And the third thing about internet technologies is it collapses space. And that is something we've got to start doing. It's not in the United States. I do this talk in the United States, so there's a global dimension to this too. But essentially, we have to tap into people all over the country, in our country, to basically move ideas in. And ultimately, we have to tap into people all over the world. In this case, my identification here in this thing is I'm working with some folks on a concept for a next generation think tank called Next Agenda. It's a project I'd love to talk to anyone afterwards. But I'm going to end basically here. I started with Obama saying this is our moment. America is our moment. It's really the world, this is our moment. There is something very fundamental, very big going on here. It's not just about Obama. Obama is just as much a symbol of it as he is a kind of catalyst of it. He's an extraordinary person, don't get me wrong. But it's not happening because of him. He is essentially a clear catalyst, but it's not all about him. He constantly uses a phrase that actually is from a progressive activist earlier in the 20th century, saying, we are the ones we've been waiting for. You know, somebody else isn't going to figure out climate change. Our children aren't going to basically figure out how to deal with terrorism. We have to figure it out. Our era's time, this constellation of generations coming together on the planet today. And if we think about it for one last sense of inspiration, this is a chart of college-educated people in the United States from 1940, even though it says 1950, the beginning is 1940 here. Less than 5% of the population had a college education. Today, as you see from that chart, it's gone up all the way to 30%. In real terms, actually, we used to have only 5.6 million people with college educations. Now we've got 86 million. Just as one example of human capital. But here's the thing for the people here can really appreciate. If you would have told Franklin Roosevelt or Churchill or all the comparable people in Europe that we're going to give you a machine you can put in not just your desk but on your hand, and you can ask any question in the world and get back all the world's related information within a second, they would have said that's magic. And we just call it Google. And every 5-year-old in America knows how to use it, right? Extraordinary resources we have to solve this stuff, which in fact we're going to have to do. So we are completely capable in America, in the world, to make the transition to these new technologies, to basically make the transition to this global society, to figure out this kind of new, you could say, sustainable formula, to transition to clean energies off of carbon-based energies, which is a huge thing, to figure out a way to live together in a much more kind of safe but a secure and long-standing sustainable way. We're totally able to do it. But it's basically got to start with everybody here in the audience and with all of us, I guess, together. And if you don't think we're going to be able to do it, just listen to Barack. Last thing he always says, which is in fact ringing true in America right now, is, yes, we can. So thank you very much, folks.
All right.
And that's the way to get a hold of me.
Wow, Peter.
Let's go back to Barack.
Whatever things you're taking, if this is how jet lag works for you,
Sorry, in from San Francisco.
I mean, we should adopt your approach to the Danish high school. You could finish 3 years of high school in 20 minutes with you as a teacher. Okay, let's do this fast, as I know you want to. The floor is open for questions. In just a few seconds, I just want to ask you a few questions first. You showed this My Barack Obama homepage.
Yeah.
I'm logged into this also. I can follow what's happening. I can make a profile. I can meet friends. I can fundraise if I want that. I can put in a zip code. I can find out what events is taking place just around me tonight. I can go there. I can see how active I am, compare compared to other people. Right now, I'm on a shared 482nd place, I think, within this profile, this community. It's really working.
Yeah.
But is it really that big? I mean, it would be fair to say that you weren't overly critical towards this phenomenon. You could argue that Barack Obama is mainly winning now because the economy is sinking, and not because of technology. Without this economic crisis, he would probably lose.
I would say that's not true. I think there is a traditional way to analyze this, and that's essentially why the newspaper media, pundit class in Washington, and everybody got it wrong. And they basically said, oh, Hillary's absolutely going to win way early. She was anointed. No way she could lose. So they've been saying constantly, kind of miscalling this election, oh, young people won't vote. I mean, all kinds of stuff. And what I'm just saying is the current way to see why he's raising is just because of the economy. And that is a piece of it. But what is really deeper and more fundamental going on here is, I really believe, essentially, this new fundamental foundation, essentially, of politics. And I've been calling, way before this financial crisis, I've been saying, in fact, back in the spring, in fact, even earlier, saying that essentially what you're going to watch here is the Republicans and McCain do not know what's going to hit them, because a lot of the ground laying of get out the vote, a lot of the ground laying of registering young voters, new voters in Hispanic groups, a lot of the kind of new technologies that are actually happening are going to have this kind of kicker right at the end. It's like under the surface, because people aren't watching this. They're not seeing how, everyone's loading up all their social networks. They're not seeing how they're laying the groundwork for get out the vote through social networks. And so so we'll see, but I will say it's not just the climate of politics. It is essentially the fabric of politics, the foundations of politics that's changing. And what you're going to see, I think, now again, we'll see, but I think it's going to be a very substantial victory, and it's going to surprise a lot of people, not just because of the financial crisis, but because of the power of these new things that no one really realized would happen.
Extremely interesting how you link historical paradigm shifts in politics with paradigmatic shifts in technology.
Yeah.
You could argue that the last one with television meant that ideology, political beliefs, actually took a lower priority toward vis-a-vis technology, 30 seconds advertisements and so on. And now with what you're saying here, you could believe that it is going to make even lesser difference than before, because it just depends on how you master technology.
Not necessarily. The technology itself, there's a certain kind of politician or a certain kind of leader that would work in those two different environments. So broadcast television, there's no mistake that broadcast radio, when it came about, you had very powerful leaders like Hitler, you had Stalin, you had basically FDR, you had Churchill, you had very powerful, charismatic leaders, but people who could take that top-down centralized thing and really manipulate it and really do wild things. What's happening with this technology is you can't control it. In fact, it's coming up from all over. You're getting all kinds of people making ads about you. You're getting videoed every step of the way. You're getting people in private meetings using recordings of there's no way you can control it. And so the fundamental danger, one, of these kind of, totalitarian type folks is completely gone. But also, I think the kind of politician that can manipulate has to be in that environment has to be more transparent, has to be more open, has to roll with the punches, has to be have more integrity and kind of earnestness. And I think that's what people will respond to. They have to be more real. And so I think even though this technology mastered by the right person could be very powerful, I don't think it has the same dangers inherent that you actually saw in broadcast
No, I'm not
television.
talking about dangers. I'm just saying that ideology means not as much as before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what you're going to do is it's going to be a much more direct connection to voters. They're going to basically, who you are and how you lead and what your ideas are going to make more difference than whether you're the right faction of your party and have the control of all of your people and stuff.
All right.
So yeah, ideology I think is going to fade in the kind of its pressingness there.
Okay. Questions? This is our moment. Where are the mics? Microphones? Over
Hello?
here? Oh, yes. Stand up and speak loud.
My name is Lars Henrik. You talked a bit about Hispanic voters and Afro-American voters using mobile phones. What kind of impact does that have on the polls that are mainly, as far as I know, traditional telephones?
Huge
Can you
impact.
talk about that?
Everyone heard the question? Do we have to repeat it? But the question about telephones, absolutely. The idea that all these people are essentially on, particularly young people, are on cell phones and do not have landlines. There is no way in the United States to reliably tap into that 30% of the population now that has cell phones, because there's no, as you know, kind of public way to get it at those numbers. And so it is definitely skewing polling, and I think with time it's going to really, really make it problematic. And that's one of the reasons I think you're watching the polls have been so neck and neck in different weeks ahead of this. They're not counting a lot of these people I've been pointing out to who are really, really charged up.
You didn't mention this new iPhone application.
And yeah, he mentioned, we were chatting earlier, it's like, just take this iPhone application, which is phenomenal. It came out here just a week ago. I was actually part of the beta testers on this thing. With the Obama campaign, essentially came out with an iPhone application you download. And essentially what it does is it takes your address book on your iPhone and organizes the whole thing by battleground states, which in the United States is the critical states that essentially could tip the election, and says, hey, you've got 3 friends in Ohio, and you've got 6 business people, friends of yours in Florida. Just hit this and call them and see what you can do. Talk to them about voting.
Okay.
It's an incredible tool, and again, something that traditionally
now you're going too slow. Let's speed it up a little. Yes.
My name is Mette. We've heard a lot about right here. We've heard a lot about Facebook supporters and MyBo supporters during the election, the campaign. But what about using Facebook friends and networks after, like if he gets elected as president? How will he use the networks as a governing tool?
Absolutely great. This is exactly segues staccato. What I'm saying is what's happening is you're mobilizing. It's not clear, and I don't have any privy access to this, but it's possible he has something close to 10 million people on his email list, right? Actively communicating every day with about at least 10 million people, possibly more, actually. Now, those people aren't going to, once the election happens, just say, okay, I'm just going to turn on the TV and watch what happens for the next 4 years. They're going to want to say, okay, now we've won. What can I do? You know, what next? What can I do? And the same thing with the Facebook folks. They're going to say, great, they're energized. we won.
Why do you think so?
Why do you think so?
Why do you think so?
Because they felt so much a part of the victory and actually the politics of it. They weren't just watching TV commercials and voting once, in the fall. They were actually out there convincing people and putting their money in and going out to calling people
What you're
up.
saying is really that this is a fundamental democratizing of American politics.
Yeah, it is. I do believe it's a fundamental.
You really believe that?
I think it's it's energizing,
not just in fundraising,
but democracy. And I think what you're going to see, and this is why my own interest is going to after election. I think what you're going to see is a huge number of people now want to engage Washington, want to get involved in policy making, want to get involved in really involved with how do we change the country, and not just in Washington, but how do we do it in local states, and how do we really go. And again, this generation, I do a whole talk on the millennial generation. It's an extraordinary generation, and one of the things about them is they're extremely civic-minded. They're very high rates of volunteerism. They're really can-do. They're very team-oriented. They're not individualistic. And so they'll be the perfect kind of folks for this thing.
And like every other American citizen who is now 20 years old and very liberal will get 30 and 40 and more conservative and fit into the good old American mold where it's 60% Republicans against 40% Democrats. They just now have the technology that they didn't have before.
Actually, it's interesting. I turned off a slide before this talk to show you. It is not true that all young people are more liberal or progressive, and as they get older, they get more conservative. In fact, what happens in generations is very clear. You essentially form your personality, essentially, when you're young, and you tend to vote consistently for the rest of your life. It takes a generation about 3 elections to basically lock into how they think, and then they tend to go. Now, the proof of this is that the last generation before the millennials was Generation X. They were essentially, as young people, in college and in their 20s, very conservative. They actually were voted for Ronald Reagan. They were very conservative, and they are the most conservative group right now in American politics, more conservative than old people. And vice versa, the original GI, we call them the GI generation, essentially the generation of Franklin Roosevelt's young people of that time who fought in World War II and the post-war economy. That we call them the GI generation. That was like John F. Kennedy's generation. They voted for Franklin Roosevelt and were very progressive in the 30s and 40s, and they, to this day, they're 90 years old, and they're still voting Democrat. So basically, what happens is it's not just a maturing of your life cycle, it's how you crystallize your belief system early and then you carry it through life. And so I think for that reason, I think this millennial generation is not going to basically change. It's actually going to drive a new kind of politics for the next 30 years.
3 questions in a row. Yes?
Hello. Yeah. As I see it, it's all about funding right now, and using the web obviously makes it global. And my question is it possible for non-Americans to contribute? And do you have any numbers on non-American contributions, Democrats versus Republicans?
Oh, wait. No, a new question? Yeah?
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, after. We'll take this a few questions first. Yeah?
I'm from Canada, and we also have an election in Canada. And
really?
Yes. We have our own whole system and everything.
Oh.
But one of the things that's happening in Canada is we have a minority right-of-center government, and the left is split. And so the right government cut the arts funding, and so a bunch of local artists got really pissed off about this and decided to do something about it. And so they built an application that you can use online, which you enter your zip code, your postal code, and it tells you how to vote strategically. So people are transcending ideological differences, and they're voting for the Green Party or the Democrats, depending on where they live. So it's interesting how these things become action-oriented. You can actually affect your voting.
Interesting. Yeah, another one? No?
Okay. So just just the quick answer to this is you actually can't legally from abroad donate literal money to the Obama campaign or to that. You can actually, I think, donate to places like Move On and some of these groups outside of the country. But you cannot do it in political candidates. That said, is you can do a lot of other things, and you can get involved in many respects. And I'll just anyhow, there's a bunch of ways that you can throw your voice in, help organize. You can send emails. You can, help push the ball. In fact, with Skype and other things, you can probably make phone calls for that matter and say, hey, I'm setting somebody in Denmark here, and it's important to us that, you at least consider, whoever you're going to vote for, hopefully Obama. Anyhow, there is a way to do that, and I actually think it matters. I think particularly with this younger generation, very global generation, I'll just mention to this, 20% of American college students now are spending some time abroad as part of their 4-year college experience. So it's a generation that's getting much more, their attitude towards the world is much more open, and how the world thinks is very, very important, not just to them, but I think to a lot of Americans. And so I think the global opinion is an important factor, although it's not the critical piece, it certainly would help. And in terms of the other thing, I think absolutely, what I'm saying here, again, I'm from America, I'm kind of watching it from the American's point of view, but clearly this is a paradigm that's being cracked globally. These things could work in almost any, certainly Western democracy kind of situation. It is being used. There's some terrific stuff happening in Canada, as you mentioned, but also Europe's got some really neat examples of this too. And I think basically what you're watching here is you're going to see this thing just proliferate. For one thing, nobody in American politics will not do politics the way Obama's kind of done going forward in terms of presidential politics. The message is clear. This is something you got to start doing. And I think globally you're going to see the same thing happening. You're going to see whoever the kind of leading edge and tech-oriented kind of folks in Europe or any place are going to also get confidence at the very least, but also a wave of enthusiasm to start really doing this stuff. And again, there's some things we can learn across borders. There's neat stuff going on all over the world, but definitely worth tuning into right now in the States. And I don't know, do we have time, or I guess we could finish it up here? But
no, we have a little time.
Because I don't want to keep people from lunch.
We have
it's almost noon here, and
Yeah. I'm sure you can.
I'm certainly happy to stay here all day, and I can sit here and talk afterwards too.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jon Lund. I'm from IB Denmark, Foreningen af Danske Interaktive Medier. I have one question. Obama himself, how personally is he involved in the campaign online? Is he maintaining his social profile actively, blogging, status updates, etc.?
Very good question. I will say I'm not part of the campaign, and so I don't want to speak for the campaign. I will say this, but from my one thing I can say, he is a very tech savvy himself. He's a BlackBerry addict. He's constantly on the BlackBerry, constantly working with it. He, for those that are interested, frankly, he gave a phenomenal talk at Google in November of 2007. Actually, it was October, November of the fall of 2007. in which he articulated his own technology and innovation platform, but also kind of you could see his real appreciation and understanding of technology. If you really want to see that, actually, you can go to there's a site called Tech for Obama. It's a very new site, just launched here. I had a little bit to do with it, but basically techforobama.com, and if you go there, actually that video, among others, is right there, or you can go through YouTube and get it. But what it shows is this is not a guy who's just his handlers or his campaign managers telling him to do this kind of stuff. He gets it. He's a community organizer from a long time. He understands bottom up. He understands it's not about him. It's about everybody and given the tools to actually work. And in terms of the literal side of the Twittering and things like that, my basic feeling, not knowing for sure, is it's just given all the demands on him and stuff, I don't think he's literally doing his own Twitter feeds or his various updates. But he's very much involved in the framing and how that works. And occasionally I'm sure he jumps on there too, just to play it once in a while.
All right. Yeah, last question.
Well, I'm a bit disillusioned right now because I think it sounds as if structures are more important than ideology and everything else. And basically, I can't help thinking this is the first time that somebody is using social technology an election. But what about next time? Do we just roll over and say, well, demography shows that this is what the kind of result we're going to have, depending on the population at that time?
No. Well, the two things I think you're saying there, if I hear you right, is the tools themselves, I would say, although there's strategic advantage right now with Obama and the Democrats, within the next cycle, I would say, certainly in the next couple cycles, it'll essentially be a ubiquitous tool, ubiquitous approach. The model have been cracked. And no matter what your ideology is, whatever, you'll be able to kind of use these things. The great example is this happened with broadcast television. In 1960, you watched the innovation, the explosion of innovation around television and politics from 60, 64 to maybe about 66. It was essentially reinvented politics around television with John F. Kennedy and the 30-second ad and various things like that. By 1968, the guy who had run against Kennedy and got beat, Richard Nixon, partly because he didn't know how to present himself on television and in the debates and others, by 68 he won because he hired Madison Avenue and was able to just use television to his advantage. And so the point is, there's no structural advantage for any one particular ideology or, for that matter, candidate in the long term. It's just that whoever figures it out early is going to have strategic advantage, and that's Obama and the Democrats for right now. That's one piece. The other piece is I want to make clear here, even though this generational change and immigrant change is a very big force in American politics, it's still by no means the overwhelming population. And also, even though there's 60% of these folks might be voting Democratic, 40% don't. And, you can be influenced by your ideas and, persuasive arguments, or if the Democrats don't perform or Obama betrays them, people will shift. So I don't want to get too deterministic. But I will say, if in the general trending, in the general analysis of what's happening in America, you would have to take into account these meta trends of population and how are they thinking, because you're going to have a close to, not half, but it'll be a very big percentage of American population are going to be a part of these two groups. There is overlap, by the way, too, because immigrants, Hispanics particularly, are quite young, so there's a kind of a crossover there. So it's not two separate groups. They're kind of merged groups at some level. So anyhow, big deal, not determinative.
Okay,
I think we got to go.
Just last thing, coming from the old world, one can't help being a little bit, skeptical about going into an Obama office where there is a big picture of him with this glow of light around his head, the quote of the day, "Yes, we can," and so on. It seems like to a guy like me, as fantastic, amazing, interesting, but also as a kind of secular religion, which is particularly American. If you were here in the 60s, you would be talking about television, and you would say that this is a fundamental change. It will democratize the way we talk about politics and so on, and you could argue that was true, partly, but looking back, you could also argue that it would have some quite destructive consequences on democracy. If you should point at just one critical point that this could lead to something not so desirable, what would that be?
Oh, very good point here. I would say there are several problems with this technology. I don't want to be too Pollyannish. In a short period, though, to make an argument, I basically pulled all the positive things. The thing that's going to be very hard for Obama, for anybody, is that to solve these challenges, to really take on climate change, for example, is going to take some initially unpopular positions. So, for example, we're probably going to have to entertain something like a carbon tax to reshift the orientation, the incentives of the entire economy away from carbon-based fuel into renewable fuel, which is, from a policy point of view, makes total sense. From a political point of view, it is very difficult to do. And so what's happening is, given the transparency and given everyone watching and given everyone's voice in this process, it's going to be hard maybe to take the big leaps and without profound leadership and really learning and teaching to move people along. And I'm fearing that these tools could potentially paralyze a leader who has to make some unpopular but necessary decisions about how the country might have to go, and won't be able to convince everyone because these same tools are empowering everyone to kind of bring it down, kind of counter it, and raise hell, basically, because you're betraying us or something. So it is by no means is this figured out. We're just beginning the journey into these new politics and the new government of this kind of tools. But by far, I would say it's generally a positive development, and it's one that I think bodes well for the future. Okay. And love to stay connected to all you folks, and you can always contact me or afterwards, but also ping me.
Are you on the internet?
I am on the internet, and linked Facebook and LinkedIn, right. The whole thing. Pete lied.
It could also stop politicians from making stupid decisions, and that would be quite an advantage.
True,
Thank you very much for coming and sharing. It's been amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.